She sits in silence, her gaze steady, her clothing immaculate, her posture refined. At first glance, she looks like any other elegant woman from a photograph taken in the late 1800s. But as your eyes travel downward, a detail emerges that stops you cold. Her shoes, tiny, impossibly tiny, hint at something deeply unsettling. Inside them are feet that were not allowed to grow, feet that were broken, reshaped, and bound until they resembled something closer to a doll's than to a human's. Feet that carried the weight of tradition, of beauty standards, of a society that demanded suffering for status. Feet that turned a girl into what many called an ideal woman, but at the cost of her humanity. This is not just a photograph. This is a mirror into one of history's most disturbing obsessions. A practice that turned pain into elegance, deformity into desire, and cruelty into culture. It is known as foot binding, and for centuries in China, it was considered the ultimate symbol of beauty, femininity, and class. But behind the silken slippers and ornate gowns, behind the stories of grace and allure, were broken bones, infected wounds, and lifelong suffering. And here's the chilling truth. This wasn't some fringe practice carried out in secret corners of society. For nearly 1,000 years, millions of women endured it. Girls as young as 4 years old had their toes folded under, their arches snapped, and their feet tightly bound with cloth until they shrank to just 3 inches long, what was called the golden lotus. To possess these feet was to possess value. Without them, a woman risked being seen as unworthy, unmarriageable, or less than human. But pause for a moment and ask yourself, how far can a society go when beauty is valued more than freedom, more than health, more than life itself? And perhaps a scarier question, how much of that mindset still lives with us today, in different shapes, in different forms? The woman in this photo did not choose this. She was chosen for it. Like countless girls before her, her body became a battlefield between tradition and survival. Her smile, if she ever forced one, was not a reflection of joy but of endurance. Every step she took was a reminder of the cost she had paid for her culture's idea of beauty. And yet, for centuries, men wrote poems about women like her. They described the way they walked, short, swaying steps that were seen as alluring. They called their feet delicate, fragrant, seductive. But what those words really described was agony disguised as elegance. Now, imagine being her. Imagine being a child, hearing the cloth tighten around your bones for the first time. The pain searing through your body as your mother or grandmother pulled harder, believing they were helping you, securing your future, guaranteeing you a marriage, a livelihood, a place in society. Imagine the days, weeks, and months where the pain didn't stop, where walking became torment, where infection lurked in every cut. And still, you were told this was the path to honor, to love, to survival. We look at this photo today and recoil. We call it cruel, barbaric, unthinkable. But for centuries, it was ordinary. And that's what makes it terrifying. Because the most dangerous traditions are the ones that hide in plain sight. The ones that feel so normal that nobody questions them. Until centuries later, when the photographs remain, and the truth becomes impossible to ignore. This image is not just about a single woman. It is about millions of women erased from history, their names forgotten, their pain reduced to a cultural footnote. Yet here she is, staring back at us across time, forcing us to remember, to confront, to question. Her face is calm, but her feet tell a story that screams louder than words ever could. As we begin this journey into the history of foot binding, prepare yourself, not just for facts and dates, but for stories that will shake you, disturb you, and make you see beauty in a way you never have before. Because this is not just a tale about the past, it is a reflection of the present. And the more we look, the more we realize, the chains may look different today, but the weight of beauty, the sacrifices it demands, and the suffering it justifies have never really gone away. In the next part, we'll go back to the very beginning, to the courts of ancient China, where foot binding first emerged not as a punishment, but as a performance, where an emperor's fascination turned into an empire's tradition, and where a single idea, an idea about beauty, would ignite one of the longest-running and most devastating practices in human history. History often begins not with ordinary people, but with rulers, with kings and emperors whose personal fascinations become national obsessions. Foot binding was no different. To understand why millions of women would later suffer through this brutal practice, we must go back almost 1,000 years to the glittering palaces of the Tang and Song dynasties, where silk draped the walls and music filled the air. It is here, legend tells us, that an emperor became captivated by something unusual. During a private performance, one of his concubines, a dancer named Yao Nyang, wrapped her feet in silk and performed on a stage shaped like a lotus flower. Her steps were delicate, her movements restricted, her balance fragile, but the emperor was enthralled. To him, her small, bound feet looked like petals, delicate and pure, a symbol of refinement and grace. That moment, an emperor's desire, planted the seed for what would grow into a cultural phenomenon that lasted for centuries. But here is the chilling truth. Beauty often begins as a performance for the powerful, and the powerless are the ones who pay the price. What began as an imperial fascination quickly spread among the elite. To bind a girl's feet became a sign of wealth, sophistication, and nobility. Small feet meant that a woman didn't need to work in the fields. Small feet meant leisure, refinement, status. And soon, families across China began binding their daughters' feet, hoping to climb the ladder of society, hoping to please men who had been taught to see broken bones as beautiful. Think about that. A single emperor's preference, magnified by power and poetry, reshaped the lives of countless women. And yet, this is not just a story about him. It is a story about every society that has ever turned the suffering of women into spectacle. The irony is that in the early centuries, not everyone was convinced. Many Confucian scholars criticized foot binding, calling it unnatural, harmful, and against the balance of the human body. But poetry and art, the currency of cultural imagination, told a different story. Pain became poetry. Men wrote verses comparing bound feet to golden lotuses, fragile and precious. Artists painted women walking with short, swaying steps, portraying it as feminine, seductive, otherworldly. And slowly, criticism faded, drowned out by the intoxicating power of desire wrapped in silk. By the Song dynasty, foot binding was no longer a curiosity, it was an expectation. Families began binding their daughters' feet as young as 4 or 5 years old. And once the process began, there was no turning back. To unbind the feet was to undo years of pain, and often the damage was irreversible. Yet mothers, grandmothers, and aunts continued the practice, passing it down as though it were an inheritance of love rather than cruelty. They told themselves it was for the girl's future, for her survival. Without bound feet, she might never marry. Without marriage, she might never find security. Here lies the darkest paradox. The very women who had suffered became the enforcers. They believed they were protecting their daughters by breaking them. They believed they were giving them a future by taking away their freedom. And in that cycle, generation after generation was trapped, all because of an emperor's desire 1,000 years earlier. Pause for a moment. Doesn't that sound hauntingly familiar? Think of the beauty standards today that mothers pass down to daughters, standards that demand sacrifice, restriction, even harm, all in the name of acceptance. Different forms, different shapes, but the same chains. The woman in our photograph from the late 1800s was not unique. She was part of this lineage, part of this long chain of tradition that began in the palace halls of the Tang dynasty and reached all the way into modernity. And while emperors and poets are remembered by name, Women like her are remembered only through their suffering. Yet photographs, unlike poetry, cannot lie. They strip away the glamour, the illusions, and leave us face to face with reality. Look again at her tiny feet. They are not lotus petals. They are not delicate blossoms. They are scars, compressed and twisted into an unnatural shape. They are bones that once snapped under the pressure of cloth, tendons pulled until they tore, skin that blistered and bled. This is the true legacy of that emperor's fascination. As foot binding spread, it didn't just shape bodies, it shaped society. It dictated who could marry whom, who could rise in class, who could be considered desirable. It seeped into every corner of Chinese life until it was no longer a choice but a destiny. And for nearly 1,000 years, it endured. In the next part, we will step into the intimate world of the practice itself. We will see, in vivid detail, how a girl's feet were bound, how the process unfolded day after day, year after year. We will hear the voices of those who endured it, those who carried both the scars and the silence. And only then will we begin to grasp the full weight of what this photograph truly represents. If history could whisper, the whispers of foot binding would come not from emperors or poets, but from bedrooms filled with the cries of little girls. Because this tradition did not begin in palaces, it began in the home. And the home, for millions of children, became a place of both love and cruelty, security and suffering. Imagine you are 5 years old. Your world is still full of play, of clumsy running, of innocent laughter. And then one morning, your mother takes you by the hand, sits you on a wooden stool, and brings out a long strip of white cloth. You don't yet know what it means, but you see the seriousness in her eyes, and you feel the fear in the room. The ritual begins with water, warm, almost hot, soaking your tiny feet. The water softens your skin, loosens your joints, makes the bones more pliable. You feel comfort for a moment, like a bath. And then it begins. Your toes, except for the big one, are folded under the sole of your foot. The arch is forced to curve, tighter and tighter, until it feels like the bones will snap. And then, they do. A muffled crack, hidden under layers of cloth and your mother's gentle shushing. The heel is pressed forward, the sole bent until the foot forms a crescent. Then the cloth is wrapped around, again and again, tighter and tighter, cutting into skin, forcing bone against bone. The pain is unbearable, but this is only the beginning. Every few days, the bandages must be unwrapped, the wounds cleaned, if they are cleaned at all, and then the foot is bound again, tighter than before. Each time, the arch is pressed more sharply, the toes bent more cruelly, until the foot measures no more than 3 or 4 inches long. This was called the golden lotus. To achieve it was to achieve perfection at the price of lifelong agony. But here is the paradox. This cruelty was often delivered by the hands of mothers, aunts, and grandmothers. Women who had once endured the same suffering themselves. Women who remembered their own screams, and yet believed they were protecting their daughters by inflicting the same fate. To them, it was not cruelty, it was survival. Because in a world where no man would marry a woman with natural feet, to leave your daughter unbound was to condemn her to poverty, to isolation, to shame. And so the cries of little girls became the soundtrack of a culture. Some begged for mercy, some fainted from the pain, some grew ill from infections, their wounds festering under the cloth. And yet the bandages stayed. Pain became normal. Pain became expected. Pain became invisible. It is easy, from the distance of history, to shake our heads and call it barbaric. But think about the beauty standards of our own time. The surgeries, the diets, the endless pursuit of bodies that are considered acceptable. Different methods, different tools, but the same principle. Break them, mold them, shape them into something unnatural, and call it beautiful. The process of binding usually lasted years. Each season brought tighter wrappings, more pressure, more reshaping. The girl's bones softened with age, and by adolescence, the foot was permanently transformed. She would never again walk normally. Every step would hurt, but every step would also announce her desirability. Mothers whispered lies to their daughters to ease the guilt. The pain will fade. You will thank me one day. This is how you will find love. But the truth never faded. The truth was there in the infections that rotted flesh, in the toenails that grew inward, cutting deep into the skin. The truth was there in the stories of girls who lost toes, even entire feet, to gangrene. And yet the practice continued, and society praised the results. Men wrote love poems to feet they would never see without their wrappings, imagining them as delicate blossoms, fragrant and pure. The smaller the foot, the greater the praise. 3 inches became the standard. Families boasted of daughters with the tiniest feet, as though their suffering were a badge of honor. What is perhaps most haunting is how quickly pain became tradition, how cruelty became normalized. For the girls, there was no choice. For the mothers, there was no alternative. For the fathers, there was no question. And for society, there was no escape. A woman without bound feet was considered unfeminine, unattractive, unworthy. And so the cycle continued. Generation after generation, bones were broken, feet were deformed, and beauty was defined by suffering. And through it all, the silence of women was louder than any scream. Because silence meant acceptance. Silence meant survival. The woman in our photograph lived in the late 1800s, but her story was already centuries old. By the time she sat for this image, the ritual had been perfected, repeated millions of times. Her feet told the same story as countless others before her. A story of pain wrapped in silk, a story of desire disguised as beauty. But in the next part, we will go even deeper. We will step into the psychology of foot binding, not just the physical breaking of bones, but the mental conditioning that made women accept it, even embrace it. Because the greatest chains are never the ones on the body. They are the ones on the mind. When we think of cruelty, we often imagine chains, whips, prisons, and punishments. But some of the most powerful chains in history were never made of iron. They were invisible. They were made of ideas, of culture, of beliefs passed down like heirlooms. And in the case of foot binding, these invisible chains were stronger than steel. Why would a mother break her own daughter's bones? Why would a grandmother smile as she wrapped bandages tighter and tighter around a crying child? Why would women, who knew the agony better than anyone, become the enforcers of their own suffering? The answer lies in psychology, the subtle, powerful force that can turn victims into guardians of the very tradition that enslaved them. In imperial China, bound feet became a currency of social value. They weren't just a physical feature. They were a symbol, a signal, a password into the world of marriage, respect, and survival. A woman's worth was measured not by her voice, her mind, or her talents, but by the inches of her feet. The smaller, the better. The tinier, the more precious. And this belief wasn't just held by men. It was internalized by women themselves. Girls grew up watching older sisters limp, mothers wince, grandmothers shuffle slowly across courtyards. And yet, they didn't see tragedy. They saw beauty. They saw honor. They saw what society told them they must admire. And admiration, when repeated enough, becomes aspiration. It is one of the darkest truths of history. Oppression lasts longest not when it is forced, but when it is believed. Psychologists today call it internalized oppression. When you hear a message enough times that your worth depends on your suffering, you stop fighting it. You begin to accept it. And acceptance becomes identity. Women didn't just endure binding. Many of them defended it, taught it, and believed in it as fiercely as they hated it. Fathers encouraged it too, but rarely had to witness the details. To them, it was simply a tradition that guaranteed their daughters a future husband. It made economic sense. And in a world where survival often depended on marriage, Economics became destiny. But men were also conditioned. They were taught that small feet were beautiful, delicate, erotic. Stories circulated about women with 3-inch golden lotuses, praised in poetry, celebrated in art. Men were told to desire what was unnatural, and they did. Desire itself became a form of enforcement. Imagine being a young man in 19th century China, told from birth that a woman's worth lay beneath the silk shoes she wore. You never saw the blood. You never smelled the infections. You only heard the romantic verses, the comparisons to flowers and moons, the idea that walking should be slow, fragile, and feminine. Desire blinded men. Tradition blinded women. And together, they built an unbreakable cycle. But there was something even more haunting. Women who had suffered through binding often felt pride in their endurance. They had survived. They had endured what their mothers endured, what their grandmothers endured. To reject it would mean to reject their own identities, to say that their pain was meaningless. And so, many passed it on, not only as tradition, but as proof that suffering gave life value. It is the psychology of endurance. If I survive this pain, then you must too. And society reinforced it with rewards. A girl with tiny, delicate feet would marry into a wealthier family. She would bring honor to her parents. She would walk, or limp, through her life knowing that her suffering had paid off. That belief, false, yet powerful, kept the cycle alive for 1,000 years. And yet, there were cracks in the system. Some women whispered their resentment in private. Some men admitted that they hated the limp, the stench of rotting flesh, the sight of their wives unable to walk. And in the late 19th century, as foreign visitors began documenting the practice, the illusion started to fracture. Outsiders described it as grotesque, barbaric, cruel, and for the first time, the invisible chains were questioned. Still, traditions rarely die easily. A belief repeated for centuries cannot be erased by a single voice, or even 100. It takes generations to break what was once unshakable. But before we move into the fall of foot binding, we must stay here. In this uncomfortable truth, the greatest prisons are never built by governments. They are built by societies. And the strongest guards are often the ones wearing the same shackles. The woman in the photograph does not look like a prisoner. Her expression is calm. Her posture is steady. But her feet tell a different story. They reveal the silent guards of tradition, the chains of psychology, the power of culture to make cruelty feel like destiny. And in the next part, we will explore how this practice began to unravel. What forces, both inside and outside China, challenged this ancient tradition? And how did women themselves begin to resist? The cracks were forming, but the struggle was far from over. For centuries, foot binding seemed unshakable. It was a tradition older than memory, passed down through bloodlines, reinforced by poetry, and stitched into the very fabric of Chinese society. But no wall, no matter how high or strong, lasts forever. And by the late 19th century, the cracks were beginning to show. The outside world was changing. Empires collided, industries surged, and global travel made once distant cultures collide face to face. Foreigners arriving in China looked upon foot binding with shock and disgust. Missionaries, diplomats, and travelers described it not as beauty, but as cruelty. They wrote reports, published articles, and sent photographs back to Europe and America. What was once a hidden domestic practice was suddenly exposed to the judgment of the world. Imagine, for a moment, being a Chinese father in 1880. You have spent your entire life believing that your daughter's bound feet will secure her a future, her marriage, her survival. And then you read a translated article, written by a British missionary, calling it barbaric, inhuman, grotesque. How would that feel? Would you reject the accusation? Or would you, quietly, for the first time, wonder if it was true? It was the beginning of doubt. And doubt, once planted, is harder to kill than tradition itself. But change wasn't only forced from the outside. Inside China, voices were rising. Scholars influenced by new ideas, Confucian reformists, Christian converts, and women educated in modern schools began to question the practice openly. Pamphlets were printed. Debates were sparked. Some compared foot binding to slavery, arguing that a nation weakened by crippling its women could never truly modernize. By the 1890s, anti-foot binding societies began to emerge. They weren't massive movements at first, just small groups of intellectuals, reformers, and activists. But their message spread. China could not step into the modern world if half its people could not even walk. And yet, resistance was met with resistance. Many families clung to the belief that unbound feet meant disgrace. If a daughter's feet were natural, her marriage prospects collapsed. Some mothers feared that letting their daughters walk freely would condemn them to poverty. For them, survival outweighed ideology. This created an excruciating divide. Some households clung desperately to tradition, binding their daughters' feet tighter than ever. Others rebelled, letting their daughters grow up unbound, risking the wrath of neighbors, relatives, and gossiping communities. In a single village, you could see the clash of centuries. One girl limping on bound feet, another running barefoot down the dirt path. The Qing dynasty itself, struggling to maintain control in the face of rebellion, foreign pressure, and modernization, also began to take notice. Reform-minded officials argued that foot binding weakened the nation's image abroad. How could China be respected if the world saw its women mutilated? By the early 1900s, the movement gained momentum. Schools began refusing to admit girls with bound feet. Employers began preferring unbound women for modern jobs. Some marriages were arranged specifically with unbound foot brides, a quiet but powerful act of rebellion. Still, the tradition would not die easily. It was too old, too embedded, too sacred for many families. The practice continued, especially in rural areas, where outside influence was weaker. For millions of women, the bindings never came off. But history had turned. For the first time in nearly 1,000 years, the practice was in retreat. What had seemed eternal now faced extinction. The question was no longer if foot binding would end, but when and how bloody the struggle would be. The photograph we began with, a Chinese woman whose feet had been bound since childhood, sits at the very heart of this turning point. She belonged to a generation caught in the middle, too late to avoid the bindings, too early to benefit from the reforms. Women like her carried the scars of a fading empire on their feet, even as the new century promised liberation. And yet, liberation would not be clean. The fight against foot binding was tangled with politics, nationalism, colonialism, and gender. It was not just a question of women's rights. It became a question of China's identity itself. Would the nation cling to the past or break free to face a modern future? The cracks had appeared, but as every historian knows, a crack is only the beginning. What follows is collapse. In the next part, we'll step into the chaos of the early 20th century, the collapse of the Qing dynasty, the rise of the Republic, and how political revolutions collided with the fight to finally end foot binding. When the 20th century dawned, China was standing on a fault line. For centuries, the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty, had ruled with rigid traditions, unyielding in its grip on both power and culture. But by the late 1800s, whispers of discontent had grown into a roar. Poverty was widespread. Foreign powers carved spheres of influence into China like vultures around a dying body. And in the midst of this turmoil, one tradition symbolized both the endurance of the past and the resistance to change: foot binding. The photograph of the bound-foot woman you saw earlier was taken during this fragile period. Her feet, shaped into permanence by years of pain, were not just a personal fate. They were political, cultural, and historical. They were a reminder of how deeply entrenched the empire's traditions remained, even as the world outside was exploding into modernity. In 1911, the Qing dynasty finally collapsed after centuries of rule. The Xinhai Revolution swept through the nation, toppling an empire that seemed eternal. The Forbidden City would no longer be the heart of power. The child emperor, Huai, was forced to abdicate. And with the dynasty's fall came a moment of possibility. Perhaps, at last, the shackles of foot binding could also be broken. But revolutions rarely bring immediate freedom. For countless women, their feet remained wrapped tightly, even as new flags waved and new leaders gave speeches about progress. The cultural grip of bound feet was not just imperial, it was familial. Generations of mothers, raised to believe that their daughters must bind their feet to be accepted, continued the practice even after the empire crumbled. Imagine, a dynasty was dead, but in villages across China, little girls still wept in silence as their toes were bent beneath them. Still, change was stirring. The Republic of China, formed in 1912, sought to modernize and redefine the nation. Leaders knew that to stand shoulder to shoulder with Western powers, China needed to shed the traditions that made it appear weak and backward in the eyes of outsiders. Foot binding became a prime target. Reformers began to campaign against it more aggressively, framing it not only as a cruel practice, but as a symbol of China's humiliation under foreign powers. The argument was compelling. How could China present itself as a modern nation when half its population was crippled by its own traditions? How could a nation rise when its women could not walk freely into the future? Across cities, particularly in the treaty ports like Shanghai, protests and campaigns gained momentum. Natural foot societies were formed, where families pledged to keep their daughters' feet unbound and to marry only women who had natural feet. These societies were revolutionary, direct challenges to the centuries-old notion that bound feet equaled beauty and status. But progress was uneven. In cosmopolitan cities, some women proudly displayed their unbound feet as a badge of modernity. Yet in rural villages, whispers of shame still clung to women whose feet had not been broken. Old habits die hard, and in this case, they died painfully slow. The fall of the Qing dynasty did not erase the past, but it cracked open a door. It gave activists, reformers, and even ordinary families a chance to step through and imagine something different. The image of bound feet became increasingly controversial, not just a sign of femininity, but a scar of oppression. Newspapers, schools, and reform societies pushed the message. China could no longer afford to mutilate its daughters if it wanted to rise. And so, during these years of political upheaval, the fate of millions of women's bodies became intertwined with the fate of the nation itself. The bound foot was no longer just a family tradition. It was a national crisis, an international embarrassment, and a symbol of a civilization at war with itself. But here is the haunting truth. Even as governments outlawed the practice and intellectuals condemned it, the bindings did not simply vanish. They lingered in hidden courtyards, in rural homes, in secret rituals passed from mothers to daughters, long after the dynasty that had supported them was gone. Tradition is stubborn, and pain, once normalized, is hard to see as pain at all. The empire had fallen, but the battle for women's feet, the battle for their freedom, was only beginning. And in that battle, victory would prove to be just as fragile, just as contested, as the revolution that had toppled the throne. In the next part, we will follow the rise of the Republic and the waves of social reform that attempted to finally stamp out foot binding for good. But as you'll see, even progress carries its own scars, and not every story ended in liberation. Some ended in silence, hidden beneath the folds of cloth that no law could truly erase. Imagine a world where silence was the expected response to pain. For centuries, Chinese women had obeyed the cruel whisper of tradition: bend, break, bind, endure. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, something extraordinary began to stir. The world was changing, empires crumbling, revolutions brewing, and within that storm, women began to find their voices. It was not sudden, nor was it easy. It was rebellion born from suffering. Some resisted not with swords, but with their bodies. The first act of rebellion was simple yet profound: mothers refusing to bind their daughters' feet. In villages, you could see a rare sight. Little girls running, unshackled, toes free to touch the earth. These women were often ridiculed, mocked as ugly, their daughters seen as unmarriageable. But they planted seeds of change, seeds that would take generations to bloom. Writers, too, rose up against the silence. Female authors and reformers began to speak of the foot as more than just an ornament. To them, it was a symbol of life and power. Qiu Jin, often called the Chinese Joan of Arc, condemned the practice in her fiery essays. She connected bound feet to the shackles of imperialism, declaring that a crippled body could never walk a nation into freedom. Her words spread like wildfire, piercing the collective conscience of a society that had long dismissed women's pain as unimportant. But resistance was not only philosophical, it was practical. Missionaries, reformers, and secret societies began organizing what were called natural foot societies. The premise was radical for its time. Pledge not to bind your daughters, and promise your sons would marry women with natural feet. It sounds almost unthinkable today that such a promise needed to exist, but in a world where beauty determined survival, it was revolutionary. The societies grew, and for the first time, real communities of resistance gave families the courage to stand against tradition. Yet, the rebellion was dangerous. Girls with natural feet often faced cruel treatment at school, mocked by their peers, or whispered about in marketplaces. Some were rejected by potential husbands. Families who defied the practice risked their daughters' futures in marriage negotiations. This is where the story takes a haunting twist. Some families, desperate to cling to both progress and survival, bound one daughter's feet and left another's free. In a single household, sisters could embody both the chains of the past and the fragile hope of the future. The world outside China was watching too. Western journalists, photographers, and reformers began publishing shocking accounts of the practice. Grainy photos of bound feet circulated in magazines, horrifying foreign audiences. These images, though often used with a colonial lens, sparked international pressure on China to abolish the custom. Ironically, the very thing that had once been a symbol of beauty became a global emblem of cruelty. China, already weakened by warlords and foreign invasions, now faced the embarrassment of global condemnation. And within this clash of cultures, the individual stories became even more powerful. Imagine a young woman, raised in secrecy, her feet tightly bound since childhood, suddenly told to unbind them as part of a new reform effort. For many, it was too late. The bones had been broken, the muscles wasted away. Unbinding was not liberation, but agony. Feet deformed for life could not simply return to their natural state. These women carried the scars forever, living testaments to the cost of tradition. And yet, even in their suffering, they began to speak, to write, to stand, not in the strength of their bodies, but in the unbroken strength of their voices. This is the paradox that makes this story so unforgettable. A rebellion fought not on battlefields, but within homes, within families, within the fragile flesh of women's bodies. The fight was not loud, yet it echoed across generations. It was not bloody, yet it scarred millions. It was not immediate, yet it forever changed what it meant to be a woman in China. And as whispers of revolution turned into roars, as empires fell and new regimes rose, the practice of foot binding stood as a symbol of the past clashing violently with the promise of the future. A future that demanded women not as broken ornaments, but as walking, running, fighting equals. Still, The question lingered in every village, in every family. Would the chains truly be broken, or would they simply be replaced by new ones? Because history teaches us one thing with painful clarity: traditions do not die quietly. They resist, they hide, they transform. And sometimes, they return in unexpected forms. It was the dawn of the 20th century, and a new flag waved over China. The Qing dynasty had fallen, and the Republic of China had risen in its place, promising reform, modernity, and a break from the cruel traditions that had shackled millions for centuries. Among those ancient customs stood one of the most infamous, the binding of feet. In 1912, shortly after the establishment of the Republic, the government officially declared the practice of foot binding illegal. Pamphlets were distributed, schools were instructed to teach against it, and campaigns sprang up in major cities declaring that a modern China could no longer tolerate the crippling of its daughters. For the first time in history, there was hope that the painful cycle would finally come to an end. But the truth was far darker. The new laws sounded bold on paper, but enforcement was nearly impossible. For centuries, foot binding had been tied to family honor, marriage prospects, and the very definition of feminine beauty. To undo it overnight was not just to change a custom, it was to challenge an entire worldview. And so, behind closed doors, in villages far from the eyes of the government, mothers continued to wrap their daughters' feet in silence. They told themselves it was for survival, for the chance that their child could still marry into a good family. They told themselves that the pain was worth it, that without small feet their daughters would be doomed to poverty or shame. Even as the government outlawed the practice, the whispers of the past continued. Unbound feet mean disgrace. Imagine being a little girl in 1915, born into a family caught between two worlds. In the city, newspapers screamed of progress and freedom. In the countryside, your grandmother tightened the cloth around your toes, whispering that only suffering could protect your future. It was a clash between a new China and an old one, and the battlefield was the body of a child. But the government did not give up. Officials launched inspection campaigns, knocking on doors in certain regions, checking the feet of women and young girls to see if the bindings had been removed. Those found guilty of continuing the practice could face fines, public shaming, or even imprisonment. In some provinces, families were ordered to unbind their daughters immediately, forcing girls whose bones had already been broken to walk again on mutilated, half-healed feet. The results were devastating. Girls screamed in agony as bindings were cut off. Their muscles, weakened from years of disuse, tore under the strain of bearing weight. Some collapsed, unable to walk at all. What was meant as liberation became another form of torture, proof that even freedom, when forced too quickly, can be as cruel as oppression. Yet despite the chaos, change was beginning to stir. Cities like Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou saw young women stepping proudly into schools with natural feet, a symbol of defiance against centuries of suffering. Missionaries and activists praised the government's stance, declaring that China was finally catching up to the modern world. But for every young girl in a modern school, there were dozens still hidden away, their feet tightly wound, their pain masked by silence. The struggle was far from over. One particularly haunting story comes from Sichuan province, where inspectors raided a village and demanded to see the feet of all young girls. Terrified mothers unwrapped the bindings from their daughters, only for the girls to collapse in tears, unable to take a single step. The officials recorded the case as a success of enforcement. But for the girls, it was a lifetime sentence of permanent disability. The cruel irony was clear. The government had banned the practice, but the damage was already done. Generations of women bore the scars, both physical and psychological. Some were proud to unbind their feet and embrace freedom. Others looked at their deformed toes and wept, knowing that no law could undo what tradition had taken from them. And still, the whispers continued. In the countryside, away from inspectors, mothers passed down the cloth strips like heirlooms. In hidden rooms, girls cried through the night as their bones were crushed, even as newspapers in the city declared foot binding a thing of the past. The abolition of foot binding was not a single moment of triumph. It was a war, a slow, painful war fought not on battlefields, but in homes, schools, and the very bodies of women. And the war was not yet won, because while the law had spoken, the heart of society had not yet changed. And sometimes, the hardest chains to break are the invisible ones. The story was far from over. In the next part, we'll uncover how the last generation of bound feet women carried the scars into the modern era, and how some of them, decades later, would finally reveal their stories to the world. By the mid-20th century, foot binding was officially outlawed across China. The government campaigns, the inspections, and the growing influence of modern education had forced the practice into decline. But the truth is that traditions, especially those bound in secrecy and reinforced by centuries of belief, do not vanish overnight. Even as China modernized, there remained an entire generation of women whose feet told a different story. They were the last to endure the bindings, the final echoes of a custom that had crippled millions before them. Some were children in the early 1900s, their feet bound in secret despite government bans. Others were teenagers whose families clung desperately to the old ways, convinced that unbound feet meant disgrace. By the 1930s and 1940s, these women were adults, living in a China that was transforming rapidly. The Japanese invasion, the rise of the Communist Party, and the coming revolution overshadowed much of daily life. But hidden beneath their shoes was a silent, constant reminder of the past, their broken feet. Imagine being a young woman in 1940, watching your brothers join the army, your sisters go to schools, while you carried a body forever marked by the decisions of your family. Outwardly, you lived like anyone else, working, cooking, raising children. But every step you took was agony. Every day a reminder that you had been chained before you could even speak for yourself. And yet, these women were not just victims. They were survivors. They learned to walk on feet that had been crushed into 3-inch stumps. They balanced their weight with dignity, some even managing to work in fields or markets despite the pain. They carried the secret in silence, never speaking of it to their daughters, determined that the curse would end with them. But silence, too, has its consequences. For decades, foot binding was rarely mentioned in public. In schools, the subject was brushed aside as a shameful relic of the past. Many younger Chinese grew up never realizing that their grandmothers or great-grandmothers had endured it. And so, an entire generation of bound-foot women slowly faded into the background of history, their stories hidden behind closed doors. That is, until some of them began to speak. In the late 20th century, journalists and researchers sought out the last women with bound feet. What they found was haunting. Elderly women, often in rural villages, sat with shoes so small they could fit in the palm of a hand. Their toes curled under their soles, their arches snapped decades earlier, leaving feet twisted and deformed. But what struck the interviewers was not just the physical damage, it was the emotional scars. Some women wept as they remembered the moment their mothers first wound the cloth strips around their feet. They recalled nights of screaming, bones breaking, and the shame of having their bindings inspected by relatives. They spoke of marriages arranged not for love, but for the size of their shoes. Others, however, defended the practice. They said it brought them pride, that it had once been a mark of beauty, that without bound feet they would never have found husbands. It was a chilling reminder of how deeply tradition can shape belief, even when it causes pain. One of the most striking moments came in the 1990s, when a group of elderly women in Yunnan province, some well into their 80s, were photographed together, each displaying her bound feet. Their faces carried the weight of history, their eyes reflecting both suffering and survival. For many, it was the first time the world truly saw the physical evidence of the custom that had once ruled China for 1,000 years. By the early 2000s, only a handful of bound-foot women remained alive. They were living relics of a vanished world, walking testaments to the power of tradition and the resilience of those who endured it. Photographers and documentarians traveled across China to capture their final testimonies before the last voices were lost forever. And here lies the greatest tragedy. For most of these women, their stories were never written down. They lived and died carrying secrets of pain, silence, and endurance. Their feet may have been broken, but their strength carried them through wars, famines, revolutions, and the birth of a new China. They were the last generation, and with their passing, the echoes of foot binding grew quieter. But history has a way of resurfacing. And as the 21st century began, the world was confronted with the haunting photographs of these women, sparking conversations not only about China's past, but about the universal dangers of beauty standards, tradition, and the price of conformity. In the next part, we'll explore how the world reacted to these revelations, and how the photographs of the last bound-foot women became symbols, not just of China's past, but of humanity's eternal struggle with the chains of tradition. For centuries, the story of bound feet was a hidden one. It unfolded behind the closed doors of family homes, whispered in courtyards, passed down through generations of women who rarely spoke of their suffering. But in the late 20th century, when photographs and testimonies of the last bound-foot women began to circulate, the world was stunned. Suddenly, what had once been an invisible pain became undeniable. The haunting images of elderly women with shoes no larger than a child's hand captured global attention. For people outside China, many of whom had never even heard of foot binding, the pictures looked almost unreal. It was as if history itself had left behind scars that refused to fade. News outlets around the globe began to publish stories about these women. National Geographic, the New York Times, the BBC, all carried features that revealed the practice to audiences who struggled to believe it had lasted into living memory. For Western readers, it was not just shocking, it was horrifying. Here was proof that cultural traditions, no matter how deeply rooted, could deform bodies and lives for centuries. But the reaction wasn't only one of horror. There was also fascination. The small embroidered shoes, with their delicate silks and intricate patterns, were displayed in museums as objects of history. Anthropologists studied them, artists reinterpreted them, and activists used them as symbols of resistance against oppressive beauty standards worldwide. And that is where the story took another twist, because the photographs of bound feet were no longer just about China. They became a mirror for the world. When audiences in the United States or Europe saw those images, many asked themselves uncomfortable questions. What are the painful, hidden sacrifices women make today for the sake of beauty? Are there customs we follow now that will seem just as cruel, just as unthinkable 100 years from now? Some drew parallels with plastic surgery, high heels, extreme dieting, or even the obsession with body image promoted by modern media. The point was clear. The story of foot binding wasn't only a relic of the past, it was a warning for the present. For China itself, the exposure was equally complex. On one hand, there was embarrassment. The government preferred to highlight progress, modernity, and economic growth, not the shame of a practice once enforced on millions of women. On the other hand, there was a sense of responsibility. Museums in China began dedicating sections to foot binding. Historians documented oral testimonies, and educators introduced the topic into classrooms to ensure it would never be forgotten. One of the most powerful moments came when documentary filmmakers recorded interviews with some of the last bound-foot women. They sat before cameras, their voices trembling, as they described what it felt like to have their bones snapped as children. Their pain became immortalized, not hidden away in silence, but shared with millions of viewers around the world. These documentaries did something extraordinary. They gave a voice to the voiceless. Women who had spent decades in silence finally told their stories, and in doing so, they became living testaments to resilience. Their bound feet were not just symbols of oppression, they became emblems of survival. And yet, as the world listened, the women themselves often seemed bewildered. For them, foot binding had been a fact of life, something endured but rarely questioned. Some could not understand why foreigners were so fascinated. To them, it was not a spectacle, but simply their reality. That quiet acceptance, the normalization of suffering, was perhaps the most chilling part of all. Still, the images did their work. They shocked, they provoked, they forced people to confront uncomfortable truths. And in doing so, they transformed foot binding from a hidden custom into a global symbol of oppression, survival, and the danger of blind tradition. By the dawn of the 21st century, foot binding was no longer a secret. It was part of humanity's shared memory, preserved in photographs, testimonies, and museum displays. The last bound-foot women were passing away, but their images, haunting, unforgettable, ensured that their suffering would never be erased. But here's the final twist. What the world saw as tragedy, some still defended as beauty. Even in the late 1990s, there were whispers in rural China of elderly men who remembered bound feet as the ideal of feminine grace. And so, the debate continued, not just about the past, but about how tradition shapes our sense of beauty in every culture. In the next part, we will step into the final chapter of this story. The legacy of foot binding, the last voices fading into history, and the lessons the world must take from one of humanity's most haunting traditions. The story of foot binding does not end in the chaos of war, nor in the bold decrees of politicians who banned it, nor even in the global outrage sparked by photographs. It ends quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the fragile steps of the last women who lived with bound feet. By the early 2000s, journalists and historians estimated that only a handful of women in rural China still carried this burden. They were grandmothers and great-grandmothers, their bodies frail, their memories fading, but their feet remained unmistakable symbols of an ancient cruelty. For many, their lives had stretched across nearly a century of change, from warlords to communism, from famine to globalization. Yet the scars of their childhood still defined them. In remote villages, researchers found them sitting by doorways, weaving baskets, or shelling peanuts, their tiny shoes resting on the dirt floor. These shoes were barely the length of a smartphone, yet they had carried these women through an entire lifetime. To see them was to see living history, fragile, yet indelible. Some women, when asked about their bound feet, shrugged with resignation. It was what everyone did. They would say, their voices thin, their eyes distant. Others spoke with bitterness, recalling the searing pain of childhood, the resentment toward mothers who had forced it upon them, and the shame they carried even decades later. And then there were those who, astonishingly, still defended the practice. It made me beautiful, one elderly woman admitted to a filmmaker in the 1990s. Her words shocked audiences. How could anyone defend something so brutal? But her perspective revealed the deepest truth of all. That oppression, when wrapped in the fabric of tradition, can disguise itself as honor, duty, or even beauty. It was this complexity that haunted scholars, activists, and audiences alike. Foot binding was not just a story of cruelty. It was a story of endurance, of survival, of women who found ways to live within the chains they were given. They did not choose it, but they carried it, and in carrying it, they carried history itself. By the 2010s, the last generation of bound-foot women began to pass away. Each death marked the closing of a chapter, the fading of living witnesses who had walked in pain so that others could finally walk free. Their funerals were small, their names often unknown beyond their villages, yet their legacy was immense. They were the last links in a chain that stretched back 1,000 years. And as they passed, something profound happened. Their images, once hidden, became immortal. Their photographs, interviews, and testimonies spread across the internet, shared in classrooms, documentaries, and exhibitions around the world. They had once been silenced by shame, but now they spoke louder than ever. For audiences in the United States, Europe, and beyond, the fascination with bound feet became more than history. It became a moral mirror. The haunting images of these women forced viewers to ask themselves, what traditions do we still cling to, even when they cause suffering? What sacrifices do we demand, silently, in the name of beauty, culture, or conformity? The answers were never simple, but that is why the story endures. Foot binding may have ended in practice, but its lessons remain urgent. At its heart, the story reveals something universal: the human cost of beauty standards, the danger of unquestioned tradition, and the resilience of those who suffer in silence. It is a story about China, but also about all of us. Because every culture has its own bindings, visible or invisible. And so, as the last women with bound feet leave this world, they leave behind more than pain. They leave behind a warning. They remind us that cruelty can wear the mask of elegance, that oppression can be disguised as love, that suffering can be passed down as duty. They remind us to question what we inherit, to challenge what we accept, and to fight for a future where no child's body is broken for the sake of beauty. Imagine one of those last women, sitting in her doorway, her tiny embroidered shoes resting beside her. Her life has spanned revolutions, wars, and transformations beyond imagination. She has lost family, endured poverty, and survived regimes that rose and fell. Yet when history remembers her, it remembers her feet. Is that tragedy, or is it triumph? Perhaps it is both, because in remembering her feet, we remember her pain. And in remembering her pain, we honor her strength. As the camera lingers on her face, her eyes seem to carry not just sorrow, but a strange kind of defiance. She lived. She endured. She refused to be erased. And in that defiance lies the final truth. Foot binding did not survive her, but she survived foot binding. The world may call her broken. The world may call her victim. But in the silence of her final years, she was something else. She was a witness. A witness to the cruelty of tradition. A witness to the resilience of women. A witness to the power of survival. And as the last of these witnesses fade into history, their story becomes ours to carry. Not as a relic, not as a spectacle, but as a responsibility. Because the bound feet of China's daughters still walk with us, not in flesh, but in memory. And memory, if we dare to face it, has the power to bind us all to the truth. So, when you see the haunting photographs of those tiny shoes, when you look at the faces of women who lived entire lives on fractured bones, remember this. Their suffering was not in vain. It broke the silence. It forced the world to look. And it left behind a lesson no one can afford to forget. This is the legacy of foot binding. A legacy written not in ink, but in bones. A legacy carried not by kings or generals, but by women who were never meant to be heard. And now, because we remember them, they will never be silenced again.